A warm welcome to John Weever Knew Part 2. I would urge you to watch Part 1 first if you haven't done so already, as this will make a lot more sense if you do. To those who have seen Part 1, I would just like a tiny bit of a reminder. It concerned John Weaver's very clever weaving. He wasn't called Weaver for nothing. Well, in fact, because he was called Weaver, he decided to do some weaving. And he wove a thread around this epigram to William Shakespeare, and the thread is woven between other epigrams in the same book. So he connects names, ideas, in order to expose what he considers to be a rotten scandal in the court of Queen Elizabeth, and that scandal concerns Edward de Vere, who he outs as Shakespeare, and Penelope Rich, who's married to Lord Rich, but seems to be happy to surrogate an heir to the Earl of Oxford, using the Earl of Southampton as father. This is brilliantly done, and I hope I've explained it well enough for you in part 1. Do revisit that. You may notice, the very sharp-eyed amongst you may notice in the bottom left-hand corner there, I've put epigram 23 addressed to Edward Allen, the actor, and showed that links by a line to Apollo in epigram 22. So it is the epigram that follows the one on Shakespeare. I didn't actually mention this in part 1, and the reason for that was I was hell-bent on showing you the scandal, and it seemed slightly irrelevant. This connection was actually found by the brilliant Oxfordian scholar, Professor Roger Stripmatter. He noticed that Apollo is being discussed in the William Shakespeare epigram, and Phoebus, of course, is a nickname for Apollo, and that the very next epigram we're talking about Phoebus, and asked himself the question, is that therefore the same person? Are we talking about Shakespeare, Edward de Vere, in that epigram too? And indeed we are, and that epigram is really about how Edward de Vere was so crucial and important in the setting up of English theatre. But as I say, I left it out of part 1 because it didn't seem quite relevant to the scandal. Okay, in this part, part 2, what I'm going to do is look at this poem, the poem to Shakespeare, without vexing you with all the links to the other epigrams in the same book. I feel I've already done that. While I was giving part 1, I left out some of the lines from this poem, and I think it's important that we look at all the lines to understand how it fits together to give a narrative about the Penelope Rich, Henry Rosalie scandal. So just to remind, Edward de Vere is identified as Shakespeare and Apollo in this poem. Penelope Rich is identified as Venus in this poem, as she was identified by Venus by so many of her contemporaries, and even by herself acting the part at court. And Henry Rosalie, third Earl of Southampton, is identified as rose-cheeked Adonis here. Don't just take my word for it again. If you haven't seen part 1, look at it, because that helps to strengthen enormously these identifications. Okay, so what we're going to do is go through this poem, excuse me, line by line, so we understand it in terms of this scandal. Honey-tongued Shakespeare, when I saw thine issue, I swore Apollo got them and none other. Well, that has two meanings, very simply, that your works, Shakespeare, seem to be written by Apollo. Apollo, as we know, is Edward de Vere, so he was called by many of his contemporaries. But it has a double meaning. When you're talking about thine issue and got them, I begat them, we're talking about children and offspring. So it's that line that I'm going to pursue through the rest of the poem. Their rosy tainted features clothed in tissue, tissue being very expensive cloth in those days, i.e. showing that these children are quite aristocratic, and that they have rosy tainted features. Taint is not something one necessarily wants, and particularly if it's not meant to be there. Again, a very small implication here that Rosalie, the rose-cheeked Adonis, might be their father. Talking of their parents seems to be the theme, because we go straight on from there to say some heaven-born goddess is said to be their mother. Heaven-born means born of heaven. Urania is heaven, means heaven or of heaven, and as we all know, Venus was born of Urania, so we are talking about Venus here. So Venus, Penelope Rich, is said to be their mother. Said to be, that's what gossip is telling us. More on their father, perhaps. Rose-cheeked Adonis with his amber tresses. Well, there are no amber tresses in Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, but you look at the picture in your top right-hand corner, and Henry Rosalie is very famous for his amber tresses, and he's rose-cheeked, which, as I said, is really giving away the fact that he's the natural father of Shakespeare's children because they've got rosy, tainted features. So does that mean that he has been having it off with Edward de Vere's mistress, Penelope Rich? Fair, fire-hot Venus charming him to love her. Yes, that's what we seem to be being told. Chaste Lucretia virgin, like her dresses. So, yes, we're given the idea that this Venus, Penelope Rich, is indeed bumping around with Henry Rosalie, i.e. rose-cheeked Adonis, even though she is dressed or pretending or feigning to be chaste virgin Lucretia, dressed up as that, but isn't, of course. Proud, lust-stung Tarquin, seeking still to prove her. Well, the her of this sentence is Venus, fire-hot Venus. But don't forget, she's disguised. She's pretending to be chaste virgin Lucretia. But Tarquin is seeking still to prove her, i.e. to prove that she is in fact sexy Venus, so that they're still having some sort of relationship together. Now, this brings in the question of Tarquin. We're obviously talking about Shakespeare's poem, The Rape of Lucrece, or Lucrece as it was known. And Tarquin is the king's son who enters Lucrece, the married woman's bedroom, and forces himself upon her. I want to just cast a little word of warning here. When one starts saying that things like Henry Rosalie is Tarquin, or Penelope Rich is Lucretia in The Rape of Lucrece, that's not strictly right, and I don't want to foster that view. What I think seems to be going on is that the poets of the age, Shakespeare, obviously, Michael Drayton, Samuel Daniel, etc., they were choosing true historical narratives or mythological classical narratives and setting them to poetry in order to highlight certain moral issues, certain bad behaviours, certain things going on in court. So when Shakespeare chose to set The Rape of Lucrece, he unquestionably did it because he was commenting upon his own scandal, just as he was in Venus and Adonis. But that does not mean that we should be absolutely literal-minded about this and say, therefore, Tarquin is Henry Rosalie and Lucrece is Penelope Rich. The scandal of Tarquin and Lucretia is serving to underline certain aspects of the scandal of Penelope Rich and Henry Rosalie, and that's the way we must see it. But having said that, I'm now going to backtrack a tiny step and point out that Shakespeare certainly does leave little clues that he is addressing the present-day scandal. Lucrece in The Rape of Lucrece is described as a rich jewel, so rich a thing, not calling her rich for nothing. When Lucrece comes to try to give the name for her assailant, with a sigh she throws forth Tarquin's name. He, 'tis he. Well, she doesn't seem to be able to say Tarquin. She's just saying he. Well, that might not mean anything to you hearing me say that, but if you, of course, read it off the page, he is H-E. H-E. He, 'tis H-E. It's as though she's starting the name Henry. She's starting to say Henry Rosalie, but she can't say the name. So there are little clues throughout Lucrece, throughout Venus and Adonis, that those parallels are supposed to be there. But as I say, can we not be too literal-minded and suppose, therefore, that Henry Rosalie raped Penelope Rich in exactly the same way as Tarquin's Rape of Lucrece is described? Because I do not think that is the case for a moment. Okay, sorry, that was a bit of a diversion. Let's carry on. So we had proud lust-stung Tarquin seeking still to prove her, i.e. to prove that Venus is fire-hot Venus and not Virgin Lucrece. Romea Richard, more whose names I know not. Here I think Weever is saying that there are characters in Shakespeare's works based upon Henry Rosalie. Acrig, who is the distinguished biographer of Henry Rosalie sets out a very good case in his biography that Richard II in Shakespeare's play is modelled upon Henry Rosalie, and many authors have tried to point out why Romeo in Romeo and Juliet is also modelled on Henry Rosalie. Now, one of the questions that arises is, why does he say Romea here and not Romeo? Which I think is a very legitimate question. Most Stratfordian scholars like to claim there's a misprint. I, as anyone who's been following my presentations will know, am very, very reluctant to cry misprint ever. People are too clever in those days, and they're usually doing things for a purpose. My guess on this one is that he said Romea rather than Romeo because he's pointing to the effeminacy of the Earl of Southampton, which is very obvious when you look at that picture in the top right corner with his long hair. Shakespeare in his sonnets 20, he addresses Southampton, saying, "A woman's face with nature's own hand painted hast thou, the master mistress of my passion, a woman's gentle heart." So I think it's pretty obvious to anyone who's come across the Earl of Southampton that he is very womanly, very effeminate, and I think that Romea may just be a little tilt at that. So Romeo Richard, more whose names I know not. In other words, rumour tells him that there are other characters in Shakespeare based on Penelope Rich and Henry Rosalie, but he can't necessarily tell you which ones they are. So that's Southampton and his effeminacy. Their sugared tongues and power attractive beauty say they are saints, although what saints they show not, for thousands vows to them subjective duty. I read that in a slightly unpoetic way to try and eke out the sense of it. Subjective duty is shown to one's husband or wife, or in the case of Southampton, to the person you're engaged to. Southampton was engaged to Oxford's daughter. Penelope Rich was married to Robert Rich. So this idea that they're claiming to be saints, but not showing proper duty to those they should be showing duty to them, despite the vows they gave. Their sugared tongues, well, we were told at the beginning of the poem, honey-tongued Shakespeare. So we are talking about the sugared tongues of Shakespeare's characters, based upon Penelope Rich and Henry Rosalie. Say they are saints. You'll remember in part one that Penelope Rich's husband, who's cast as Cario in one of Weaver's epigrams, he describes her, Penelope, as do her children, as a sacred saint. Now, what is all this about saints? I think what's going on here is a bit of a joke at the expense of Philip Sidney. You'll remember that Philip Sidney wrote the Astrophel and Stella sonnets, which were very famous in their day, addressed to Penelope Rich under the name Stella. And in those poems, Sidney writes, that both his soul and sense were captive to this saint. So he's calling Stella, Penelope Rich, a saint. He compares her image to saint's perfection. Well, as court gossip spread to Cambridge and outside of the court about Penelope Rich's rather louche and lewd behaviour, it became more and more ridiculous, if you like, that she was described as a saint by Philip Sidney in these famous poems. So you do find a bit of joshing about this. A work called Willoughby, his Avisa. I will come to this in due course because it's a very important work regarding this great scandal of court. Avisa comes from the Latin avis, meaning a bird, is all about Penelope, which comes from the Greek, meaning a certain bird. And it's the retelling of the story, the Greek story of Penelope. And in it, you get characters who are obviously trying to seduce Penelope, or Avisa. One of those characters is just known as HW, which obviously stands for Henry Rosalie, and another of those characters is just known as WS, which obviously stands for William Shakespeare. And Henry Rosalie calls Avisa, i.e. Penelope, England's saint, and William Shakespeare responds, "She is no saint." So the sort of joke about her being a saint carries on. Actually, I'm going to show you one more example of this. This is from Michael Drayton's Matilda, published in 1594, so right at the height of the court scandal concerning Oxford Penelope Rich and Henry Rosalie. He starts by talking about Fair Rosamond. This is the poem by Samuel Daniel, in which Rosamond creeps into the bedroom of the married king during the night for sexual intercourse. And as we know, those of you who have seen my presentation on Polymantia will know that this is all connected to the scandal. So fair Rosamond, of all so highly graced, recorded in the lasting book of fame. Fame, by the way, means infamy in those days as well as normal use of fame. And in our sainted legendary placed by him who strives to stellify her name. Well, that's a not too subtle reference to Philip Sidney, who, as I say, casts Penelope Rich as Stella, so he strives to stellify her name, and places her in our sainted legendary by calling her a saint. So a fairly unsubtle allusion to Penelope Rich there. Yet will some matrons say she was to blame, though all the world bewitched by his rhyme, yet all his skill cannot excuse her crime. Lucrece, okay, there we go again, you see, we're connecting Rosamond, Lucrece and Stella, Penelope Rich together, all in the same breath. Lucrece, of whom proud Rome hath boasted long, lately revived to live another age, and here arrived to tell of Tarquin's wrong, her chaste denial, and the tyrant's rage. I presume the tyrant, of course, is Penelope Rich's tyrannical husband, Robert Rich. And the tyrant's rage, acting her passions on our stately stage. Now, some Shakespearean scholars have tried to say, well, this can't be about Shakespeare's Lucrece because it seems to be about a play if she's acting her passions on our stately stage. I think they're wrong. All the world's a stage, let us not forget, and our stately stage seems to be a reference to the court. And if she's acting her passions, yes, that's Penelope Rich is having it off with another courtier called Henry Rosalie. Okay, back to the last two lines. Let's deal with them. They burn in love thy children, Shakespeare. Well, that is telling us once again that the children of Shakespeare are in fact the children of fire-hot Venus. They share the same characteristics. If they're burning in love, Venus is the goddess of love, just as in the same way their rosy, tainted features betrayed the fact that they were in fact the natural children of rose-cheeked Adonis. It's the same sort of thing. So they burn in love thy children, Shakespeare, heat them. Now, why would you heat someone? Oh, by the way, don't panic about it saying het them. That is actually quite normal, obsolete now, but het was a way of spelling heat. They burn in love thy children, Shakespeare, heat them. Why would you heat anybody who is already burning in love? Well, someone who's burning in love is almost certainly in hell, and it is in hell where you burn people who are already burning. So what Weever is saying is he's thoroughly disapproving of this behavior, and he's talking about burning up the souls of people by the fires of hell. Go where thy muse more nymphish brood beget them. In other words, he's telling Shakespeare to go to hell, the place where your nymphish brood, i.e. these characters that you've created based on Penelope Rich and Henry Rosalie, where they are begetting your children, where they are fornicating, copulating out of marriage in order to beget your children. Now, perfectly reasonable question you might ask, why would you describe Penelope Rich and Henry Rosalie as the nymphish brood of Edward de Vere of Oxford? Well, don't forget that Oxford is known as Apollo. The nymphs were part of the coterie of Apollo, so that makes sense. I think if you're describing Penelope Rich as a nymph, you are obviously alluding to the nymph Penelope. This nymph in ancient Greek mythology was the mistress of Hermes Mercury. And we've been talking about how Edward de Vere was cast by his contemporaries as Apollo, but he was also known as Mercury Hermes, compared to Mercury Hermes famously by Harvey, Gabriel Harvey, the Cambridge Don, who described Edward de Vere as winged like to Mercury. And of course, as Shakespeare, we have, among others, Ben Jonson, who describes Shakespeare as like Mercury. So Penelope, the nymph, was the mistress of Mercury, the mistress of Edward de Vere. And why do we call Henry Rosalie a nymph? I would suggest that is to do with John Weever's extremely learned line and knowing a lot of Greek, which he most certainly did, and he would have known the word Greek word for nymph, which is nymphe or nymphe, and that is defined by Hesychius, a work that certainly Weever would have known, as, among other things, a rosebud. And of course we remember that Henry Rosalie is described as the fairest bud the red rose ever bare by Thomas Nash, and Shakespeare talks of his budding name. So that's why he is a nymph, your nymphish brood. So what he's saying in that last line, Weever, is he's saying, go to hell, in no uncertain terms, where the fornication of your nymphish brood is begetting your children. Burn in the fires of hell. William Shakespeare. Hope you've enjoyed that. Please subscribe if you did, and press the little bell, and you'll be notified each time I upload something new.